They were calling it 3-Eye Atlas, an interstellar visitor with behaviour no comet should have. Power grids flickered, satellites glitched, and a single perfectly timed blackout swept across the ocean like a scalpel. Coincidence or contact? Tonight, we follow the breadcrumbs and will look into 3-Eye Atlas that might have just launched its first attack. Let's begin. The night it appeared was the kind that tricks you into thinking nothing important could possibly happen. Cloudless ordinary air. The dome motors yawning their familiar yawn while the sky slides past like a slow river of glass. In the control room, someone had left a cold cup of coffee on a stack of printouts, and the only light was the blue heartbeat of a monitor refreshing. Then a tiny smear of motion nudged itself into the star field, off-angle, off-tempo like a drummer who refuses to count in with the band. At first, they assumed it was a satellite flare or a streak of high-altitude ice. The software flagged it and filed it like a clerk who has already decided your form is wrong. But the smear kept returning to the same patch of sky, brighter on the second pass, brighter still on the third, and the centroid wouldn't sit still. When the system finally committed to a track, a shout went up, the kind of shout that ends with a question mark. Phones were pulled from pockets. A second telescope was tasked for confirmation. Within minutes, there were 3 separate sets of eyes on it. The main scope, a smaller piggyback refractor, and an older unit they called the Fossil, which had outlived 3 administrations and a roof leak. The first surprise was speed, too quick for a lazy, long-period visitor, too confident for the usual rubble that grazes our neighbourhood. The second was the way the light changed. Not the simple, bright, dim rhythm you expect when a lumpy object tumbles and presents different faces, but a tidy cadence that seemed to breathe on a schedule. It would rise with a clean shoulder, hold as if listening, then step down like a dancer onto an unseen mark. Even the skeptics went quiet. You can deny a lot of things in astronomy, but not a pattern staring right back at you in your own data. By dawn, raw observations were already out to colleagues half a world away. Confirmations arrived in the same shaky grammar of excitement. Got it. Fast, hyperbolic, weird light, please check. The informal channel lit up. The one that sits under the formal papers and above the public press release, where careers are both made and saved by the right emoji at the right time. Someone proposed the nickname, then corrected it, then typed it again. The name stuck because of how it sounded when spoken aloud, like a riddle and a warning at once, 3-Eye Atlas. An orbit solution was drafted in pencil first because no one wanted to ink a path that might embarrass them later. It arced from nowhere we own, aiming for nowhere we chart. The numbers brought back the ghost of another visitor and the uneasy thrill of trespass. Interstellar. Uninvited. Taking our gravity like a handrail on a public staircase. The press would be told comet, because comet is a word people keep in their kitchen drawer. But inside the late-night calls and the jittery quiet group chats, the whisper was different. The whisper said, "Look how it breathes." They tore apart the light curve as if it might hide a switch. Outgassing can do strange things. Sunlight can boil surface ice into jets that shove a body around like a fire extinguisher in 0G. Naturalists in the room argued for patience, but the pulses didn't smear the way heat-driven jets usually smear. They were clean, abbreviated, and just when you thought you could predict the beat, it paused, consistently, defiantly, in the same place every cycle, as if waiting for a reply that never came. A junior analyst in a time zone that had already seen tomorrow ran the data through a filter designed for hunting radio interference in deep space telemetry. No equations, just the bad habit of curious minds, the pattern sharpened. 3 peaks, equidistant, tucked neatly inside a larger envelope that itself drifted slowly, as if a lighthouse beam was sweeping across a coastline you couldn't see. He posted a screenshot with 3 arrows and didn't add a caption. He didn't have to. The room filled with typing then fell into that special silence where everyone is doing the same thing and no one dares to say it aloud. Natural bodies don't try to be interesting. They are beautiful by accident and inscrutable by design. When rock or ice tumbles, the brightness tells a messy story of shape, spin, shadow, and chance. What they were seeing looked less like a diary and more like a metronome. The senior astronomer, a woman who had taught 2 generations to love error bars more than headlines, finally pushed back from the console. "We're not going to call it a signal," she said, "because we didn't listen. We only watched." But even she ran a back-of-the-envelope check against known spin states and shrugged in a way that said, "I don't have a drawer for this." By the second night, small observatories that never make the news were stealing time between scheduled targets just to grab a few minutes on 3i Atlas. Amateur astronomers with rigs better than most university gear contributed photo frames that stitched into an accidental documentary. A visitor flickering on beat, swinging past the constellation boundaries like a person ignoring the painted lines of a parking lot. The first think pieces appeared, trying on metaphors like jackets, searching for the one that fit. The official notice, when it came, was careful. It leaned on sobriety and precedent. It used all the words you use when you're trying to keep the world from sprinting ahead of you. Preliminary, under review, consistent with natural processes. But inside the data, the story kept cheating past the margins. The brightness peaks aligned not just with rotation, but with geometry. Angles that placed Earth in a particular relationship to the Sun and the object. As if the thing were turning its best face to the best listener. When the cadence shifted, it did so discreetly, not with the elastic drift of chaotic motion, but with the click of a setting changed by an invisible hand. The older tech started telling the younger ones to go home and sleep. The younger ones didn't. The object brightened another notch, throwing a tail thin as handwriting, and someone joked that it had finally put on its comic costume. No one laughed. Naming is a spell, and 3i Atlas was a spell that refused to behave. The syllables bled into conversation like a rumour you don't want to spread but can't keep to yourself. News desks began to practice saying it on air. Conspiracy forums claimed it had been here for years. Survivalists sold kits. The stock price of a small optics company jumped because a rumour said their glass was on the main scope. None of it mattered inside the rooms where the graphs lived. In there, only the cadence mattered, and the question of what, if anything, it wanted. A veteran radio astronomer who had sworn off late nights since her second grandchild was born broke her rule and came in, bad coffee in hand. She listened to the summaries, nodded through the impatient parts, and asked to see the rawest possible view, the version before anyone had smoothed or normalised or helped the data behave. She watched in silence, then asked someone to overlay the background noise from a different instrument that had been tracking the same patch of sky for unrelated reasons. The overlay looked like static until you knew what to look for. Once you knew, it looked like a door frame. There was nothing you could print in a textbook about that moment. No board of directors would fund the feeling you get when the universe clears its throat. But the room had it. A shared, electric certainty that the ordinary explanation was going to be too small this time. They began building a new plan on the fly. Coordinated observations across wavelengths, tighter timing windows, a sweep of archival data to see if the same cadence had ever brushed past us before. They drafted an open call to colleagues with equipment that could watch without blinking for hours, because the beat they were chasing seemed to hide its most interesting turns between the obvious ones. Meanwhile, the object kept coming. Not fast enough to scare anyone on television, fast enough to keep professionals awake. It skimmed the edges of our attention, like a hawk testing the thermals above a field. Each fresh set of measurements nudged the track by a hair's breadth, and each nudge saved or erased entire futures of where it might pass. The light never degenerated into chaos the way everyone secretly hoped it would, because chaos would have let them all go home. It stayed groomed, polite, maddeningly intentional. The first time the pattern echoed in a completely different data set, an ionospheric reading from a station that didn't care about comets or visitors or press releases, the youngest person in the room swore under their breath, then apologised, then didn't apologise. The senior astronomer closed her eyes like someone about to make a promise they might have to break. "We are observing," she said softly. "A system." She didn't say machine. She didn't say mind. She didn't have to. And in the city far below, where the horizon is a permanent glow and the sky is a rumour, no one knew that a new character had walked onto the stage. The morning shows were busy, the trains were on time, a singer released a surprise album. A politician said the thing politicians say when they want to be invited back. Somewhere, a child pointed at the daytime moon and asked a question that would have sounded silly to anyone who'd stayed up all night watching the universe blink. By the time the headlines learned how to say 3i Atlas without laughing, the people who had first seen it had already forgotten how to sleep. The logs from those nights read like a long breath held underwater. Times, magnitudes, exposure runs, calibration notes. Tiny human messages snuck between the lines. Check the offset. This one is clean. Call me if it shifts again. Later, when it became necessary to decide what counted as the beginning, many would point to a frame captured at 3:17:14 local, a modest exposure where the object was neither brightest nor best defined. That was the first time the beat stepped aside for a bar, the first pause that felt like a glance. It made no sound. It left no mark. But the people who saw it all agreed afterward that something had turned toward us, just enough to say, "I see that you see." Nothing exploded. No cities blinked. The stars did what they always do, burned extravagantly in a silence so loud it makes poets lazy. The only thing that changed was a room full of humans realizing the sky had just become a conversation, and the first word had already been spoken by something that refused to be only a comet, something wearing the name 3i Atlas like a mask it could take off whenever it wished. It began in a part of the ocean with no postcards, just grid squares and the weather numbers, a long corridor used by ships that prefer routine over scenery. Navigation notices call it a lane. Sailors call it the boring part. Just before dawn, the water looked like hammered lead and the wind pressed everything flat. A container vessel on autopilot droned east. A fisheries patrol trawler idled on station waiting for a relief crew. 50 kilometers away, a research ship's team babysat 2 high-altitude survey drones, tracking a storm front that never arrived. Far below the horizon, a chain of smart boys ticked their heartbeats into the network every 30 seconds, as faithful as metronomes. At 3:11:02 UTC, the first boy missed a beat, then the second, then the chain went dark like someone pinched a hose. The patrol trawler's VHF squeal vanished mid-sentence, the container ship's AIS repeater froze, then the autopilot annunciator threw a polite, impossible message. No sky. The helmsman grabbed the wheel, blinked at an empty GPS panel, and felt the ship briefly sag as the servo handed control back to hands and muscles. On the research deck, the storm team watched their drones flicker, drift, and then fold their wings in the air. Parachutes out, slow white flowers against the grey, smashing into small circles nobody would see. Silence is never really silent at sea. There's the hiss of the wind, the thump of water on steel, the electrical gardens of instruments breathing. But this was the other kind, the kind that steals the small chatter that makes machines feel alive. The trawler's radio operator tapped the mic and heard only his own pulse in his ears. He tried the backup, the emergency, the handheld he kept as a talisman. Nothing. The ship's clock kept time, the engines ran, the lights stayed on. It wasn't a power failure. It was as if someone had told the air itself to hold its breath. 6 minutes, 14 seconds, that's what the logs would say later. In the moment, it felt like the stretch between lightning and thunder when you count without meaning to. The container ship's captain stood behind the helmsman and watched the magnetic compass swing 2 degrees slow. The star tracker failed over to a humble gyro and kept the heading steady. Over the research ship's intercom, a voice said, "We're deaf," and no one answered because there was nothing helpful to say. Onshore, at an ocean monitoring centre that smells like coffee and old ozone, an analyst watched the buoy map lose colour in a neat oval as precise as a stamp. The oval slid half a mile and stopped. perfectly framed by an arc of radar coverage that also thinned, not gone, just shy, like a curtain drawn to a whisper. An alarm that had never been used did its best to be useful. The analyst took a breath, ran a diagnostic, then called a supervisor who was already running down the hall. At 3:17:16 UTC, the world exhaled. Radio snapped back in mid-word, as if a conversation had continued without them. The buoy chain lit up one by one, their time codes aligned to the second, calmly acting like nothing had happened. The research ship reacquired its satellite link. A chirpy voice announced a queue of pending messages. The container ship's panels filled with constellations again, and the autopilot asked a little sheepishly to take the helm. On the trawler, the radio operator keyed and said nothing, then said, "Test," and flinched when 3 other voices said it at the same time. No smoke, no heat, no sickly smell of fried coils. The only evidence was the way people looked at their screens a beat longer than usual, as if the display might try a trick. Crew wrote notes they never usually heard right. Weather clear, sea state 3, all else normal. The research team launched a small inflatable to fetch their drones, cursing the salt in the parachutes and the sand in the motors. One drone had recorded something odd right before it gave up. Its altimeter slurred for one reading, like the air got thicker at nothing height. The pilot circled it in red because it felt like the kind of detail you might forget when someone asks later what it felt like. The phone started ringing in the places where phones ring after odd things. A maritime rescue centre took calls from polite captains who are not paid to be poetic and who nevertheless used words like hollow and gone. A private satellite operator saw a dip in traffic over a polygon that matched the buoy oval to within the width of a pencil line. A coastal HF site logged a waist-shaped notch in its ionospheric returns as though the sky above that water had been scooped, not smashed. Signal strength strong above, strong below, thin in a cone in between. People reach for explanations they already understand. The first to guess was the sun. Solar weather makes radios sulk. It turns the upper atmosphere into a funhouse mirror. But the solar data feed showed nothing loud enough and nothing so tidy. Thunderstorms can make pockets of mischief. There were no storms. Military tests throw tantrums in the spectrum. Range control phones said, with unusual speed and unusual courtesy, that they owned and broke nothing that night. Somewhere, a rumour machine stitched those 3 facts into a larger story, and the larger story took less than an hour to collide with the name the astronomers had been repeating under their breath. 3I Atlas. You don't need equations to understand what the analysts saw when they stacked their maps. The oval on the sea, the cone in the sky, the exact window of 6 minutes 14 seconds, each of those overlaid cleanly with the track and timing that said 3I Atlas was looking in from a line only a visitor could own. Picture a flashlight beam passing through fog, except the fog lives in the thin electric skin of the planet, and the beam is a subtraction, not an addition. No burn, no blast, just a subtraction of chatter, drawn as if with a compass from a vantage point far, far off the shoulder of the world. On the radio forums where hobbyists sift the band edges for odd music, someone posted a waterfall plot with 3 neat teeth missing from the static, equally spaced, like the bite of a careful animal. Mariners posted pictures of panels that looked perfectly healthy and did nothing for exactly as long as everyone else's did nothing. A ham in a coastal apartment typed, "I thought my antenna snapped," then later edited to add it didn't. A technician at a satellite ground station swore softly when he noticed the clock skew on one rack correct itself exactly when the silence ended, as if embarrassed to be caught out of step. The official notes that went out in the first hour wore the usual clothes. Intermittent communications degradation reported. Cause under investigation. No safety of life incidents. They were not lies. They were the safest possible sentences. Over a private bridge, a half-dozen engineers who have spent their careers coaxing signals through an unruly sky compared scribbles and found themselves using the same phrase without agreeing to hollow cone. The cone had edges so clean that one of them joked about blueprints. Nobody laughed. Someone muted their mic and swore into their sleeve. Ships kept moving. The trawler set up a new watch bill that included, for the first time anyone could remember, a 20-minute backup headset check. The research team fished their drones out of the grey and hung their parachutes to dry from the aft gantry like surrender flags. The container ship's captain filled out a report and chewed a mint until it turned to dust, then wrote in the margin, "No sky," because it still bothered him that a computer had chosen those words. On land, a radar physicist with a knack for seeing patterns in noise made a quick dirty model of the cone and traced its axis backward along the field lines that bind the ionosphere to the planet's magnetic bones. The axis pointed up, out, along the same piece of sky where 3i Atlas would have sat at exactly that time. She didn't publish it. She sent it to 3 colleagues with the single line, "If this were a demonstration, this is how I'd do it." One of them wrote back, "Demonstration of what?" She left the reply box empty for a long time, then typed, "Control." 6 minutes 14 is just long enough to get your attention, and just short enough to dodge responsibility for everything that could have gone wrong. A container ship could turn itself through a pier in that time, a plane could drift, a distress call could be missed. None of that happened. The silence picked a patch of ocean where the busiest thing moving was boredom. It felt less like aggression and more like a hand reaching out to tap a glass. The message was not, "I can break you." It was, "I can touch you without touching you." By afternoon, the phrase "first silence" had started to stick in the messages between the people who had seen the graphs. They didn't like naming it, as if the act of counting would invite a second, but language hunts for handles. A small review group spun up to compare all the clocks that would let them. They found absurd agreement. Instruments that never agree suddenly agreed to the second about when they had nothing to say. The buoy firmware showed no resets. The radios did not log faults. The satellites did not tip into safe modes. It was as if time itself had gotten up to answer the door and returned with its hair neatly combed. That evening, the senior astronomer who had warned everyone not to say signal listened to the maritime brief without touching her tea. When someone linked the map of the cone to the projected bearing of 3i Atlas, she pressed her finger to the screen at the point where the line met the ocean and said, not loud and not soft, "There." No triumph, no dread, just the strange composure of a person who knows what it feels like when a theory stops being a theory. She asked for the rawest data, the kind with the mistake still in it. The shape was still there, sitting inside the ugly bits, a neat subtraction shaped like intent. In the following days, people who weren't supposed to know began to guess. A long-haul captain told a bartender who told a blogger who posted a story about ghosts in the water. The story got the time wrong, the place wrong, and the important word right: silence. Meanwhile, in rooms with no windows, a list of questions gained numbers. If it can do this here, can it do it there? Does it need the ionosphere as a handle, or is the handle just convenient? Did we see the edges? Because we were lucky, or because we were meant to? And the one nobody wanted to write down? How close does the 3i Atlas have to be to draw a circle like that? The ocean forgot the way big things forget small shocks. Waves kept marching, the boys kept their appointments, but the data did not forget. When analysts layered the minutes leading up to the event, they found a prelude they had missed the first time. 3 small dips in the background noise, evenly spaced, too polite to trip an alarm. If you laid that prelude next to the light pattern the sky watchers had been arguing about, the coincidence stopped being coincidental and started feeling like a calling card. 3 beats, a pause, the hush. Nobody said attack in the first day, not in the official rooms. The people on the water didn't want that word, the scientists didn't either. But a thing can be gentle and still be a test. You show you can take away the one sense that lets machines see each other in the dark, and you do it without leaving fingerprints. You choose a quiet patch so nobody dies. You use a time that makes the mathematicians sit up in their chairs, and you time it for the hour when people who have been watching you all week are still awake, because you know they'll notice. That was the part that made even the skeptics put their hands flat on the table. Not the power, the timing. When the next day's memos went out with careful language and careful apologies, They included a single sentence that wasn't for the public. Recommend continuous multi-band observation of 3-eye atlas during subsequent passes. Treat all coincident anomalies as correlated until proven otherwise. In plainer speech, watch the visitor and assume the silences belong to it until the universe proves you wrong. No one wrote what they all felt, that the first silence had been both a courtesy and a warning. A clean circle drawn in borrowed sky with a suggestion folded inside. I can choose where and I can choose when. The first time they saw it, they didn't know what they were looking at, only that the noise had developed a heartbeat. It lived in the skirts of the spectrum where nobody expects anything polite. Down among the slurs and rust of the ionosphere, where lightning writes long, messy sentences and the planet hums its low, ancient chord. The junior tech in a maritime centre stared at a waterfall plot and felt the odd tug of recognition, the sense you get when a crowd of strangers laughs in unison and you don't know why. 3 neatly spaced bytes were missing from the static, equal gaps, clean edges, like teeth marks you could measure with a ruler. He took a screenshot and sent it to a mailing list titled Oddities, which existed so people could stop bothering their supervisors with ghosts and lesson plans. Half a world away, a ham operator in a high-rise scrolled past the message while tuning a loop antenna against the radiator in his apartment. He frowned, clicked back, and checked his own overnight recording. There they were again. 3 bright, thin scrapes against the grey. He dragged a finger along the timeline. The 3 notches repeated every so often, not frantic, not lazy, unhurried, confident. In another building that smelled like dust and cooled metal, a radio astronomer had been told not to use the big dish for anything that wasn't on the schedule. She didn't. She used an old array that nobody loved, pointed just off the track of the skyborne visitor, because that was where the politics ended and the science could begin. The array's data came back ugly as usual. She smoothed it the way you smooth a sheet before sleep. Then she folded it over on itself, a trick you do when you want to see if the pattern echoes. The echo answered. 3 peaks, shoulders aligned, spaces identical within the insult of measurement. She pushed her chair away and stared at nothing the way people do when the thing they've been trying not to think about shows up wearing a name tag. The signal, or the absence of one, was not strong. It did not shout, it asked, but it asked everywhere at once. In a coastal lab where they measure the sky's bend, the ionosonder's trace came back with a small, reliable kink that timed itself with the 3-beat scrape on the radio bands. In a trailer on a hill where a defence contractor keeps an honest radar that tells fishermen when the sea will be rude, the return showed a microscopic hitch that would not matter to boats, did not matter to boats, but mattered now because everyone was looking. A graduate student with the kind of insomnia that ends careers or makes them dragged gigabytes of unglamorous background from a magnetometer station and found that the planet's breath had stuttered, a tiny regular wavering that didn't belong to weather or to industry or to love. The first instinct was to blame the gear. Engineers catalogued the suspects. A bad clock, a loose ground, a lazy antenna, a satellite crowded onto a frequency it didn't own. They ran through the rituals that clear consciences and grant sleep. Swap the cable, swap the antenna, move to the backup site 2 valleys over where the lights buzz differently. Still the 3 marks returned, snipping at the same place in the static as if the noise itself had been taught to step aside every few seconds to let something invisible pass. On the private channels where scientists speak to one another like cousins at a wake, there were rules. Don't say it's artificial, don't say it's a message, don't say anything that makes people come to your office with cameras. But everyone found a way to circle the same campfire without naming it. One called it a triplet, another said trident, then took it back because it sounded like a headline. A third wrote blandly, 3-interval film or feature, and underlined 3 the way a person underlines a date they hope to forget. Then the astronomers turned their telescopes from the unblinking stare of the sky to the softer, sideways glance of radar. Just a whisper, really, a low-power ping that would not nudge a moth. They tilted it not at the object itself, The official word was that this would be premature. The unofficial word was don't poke the bear. But near it, as if listening to someone by facing their friend, the echoes came home like coins tossed into a fountain, messy, low, easily swallowed by noise. And yet when the returns were stacked and sorted and laid along the time axis like tiles, the cadence put its fingerprints down. 3 bright flecks, 3 breaths of quiet. A pause long enough to be mistaken for forgetfulness, then the pattern again. It could have been an illusion. The brain loves threes, loves patterns even more. They played a mean game on themselves, shuffled the timestamps, flipped the data, had the computers pretend that the world had happened in a different order. The pattern disappeared when the days were scrambled. It returned when time was set back on its feet. Not a trick of eyes, a trick of something else. The oldest person in the room, who had once worked weather for artillery units and still kept a lanyard from a base that no longer existed, said quietly, "If I wanted to announce myself to every engineer on Earth without terrifying the farmers, I'd tickle the places they keep for noise." Nobody asked him to explain. Everyone understood. The raw, low mess of the electromagnetic world is where secrets survive and where the right kinds of ears live. If you leave your signature in a place where only the curious look, you ensure that the people who find you ask to be there. Meanwhile, the 3-beat scar turned up in unlikely places. A technician responsible for calibrating satellite phones found that during the exact minute of the ocean silence, his test tone had grown faint and regular blisters, like wind over bottle mouths. A submarine communications analyst, which is a job title you pretend not to have in front of strangers, reported that a background snapshot taken for routine reasons had acquired the same 3 notches, even though his kit lived beneath the noise where most things refused to follow. A graduate student who had dust on her shoes from a desert antenna field realized the triplet was faintly printed on the skirts of meteor scatter. Those brief, bright scratches on the air when stones flashed themselves to ashes. Stones didn't write in 3s. Something else did. They called the pattern everything they could without calling it a name. Signature, stamp, watermark, key. The metaphors spilled because the human mind longs to grasp, to weigh, to hold. An engineer suggested thinking of it like a password hint. Something that didn't grant access by itself but reminded you which door to try. Someone else said, what if we're the ones being reminded? News of the triplet escaped the professional corral the way all good secrets escape. Not through malice, but through enthusiasm. A hobbyist with a neat shack and a neater blog posted a cleaned up slice of static with the 3 bytes highlighted in green. He called it the teeth. The comment section did what comment sections do. Within hours, the image had been memed, mocked, overpromised and set as the desktop background for 1,000 people who had never tuned a radio in their lives. The original poster took the image down, then put it back up with a note asking people to be kind. They weren't. They never are. But more sets of ears turned to that patch of skew. For a day and a night, the chatter hummed louder than the thing inside the chatter. People looked where they had never looked before. Not everyone found it. Some systems were deaf to that part of the world. Some places on Earth refused quiet. But enough people in enough quiet corners saw the missing slivers and the returning rhythm that the statistical word no longer felt like hubris. Repeatable. At one of the last surviving longwave stations, an elderly engineer who had forgotten more than most teams know, coaxed a temperamental transmitter onto a blank midnight and listened with a coil of copper he had wound in the 1970s. He wrote the times in a notebook that smelled like pencil shavings and winter. When he finished, he added up the intervals and smiled, not because he was happy, but because something old in him relaxed, like recognizing a face in a crowd. The numbers weren't special, the discipline was. Whoever left the prints knew they were being watched by people who value rhythm more than volume. On the 3rd evening after the first silence, the senior astronomer asked the room to do a small dangerous thing. "Slide it," she said. "Don't compare the graphs to themselves. Compare them to the brightness curve from the sky." The request was simple and loaded. Underneath it said, "Let's see if the heartbeat in the static matches the breath of the visitor." They slid. The triplet in the radio garbage place lined up. Not every time, not perfectly, but in the way that weather forecasts sometimes get the rain exactly on the minute and sometimes a little slantwise, close enough to hurt. When 3i Atlas brightened, the notch pattern grew cleaner, as though the object were turning, showing an edge that sharpened the trick. When it dimmed, the teeth blurred, not gone, just behind gauze, like a hand behind frosted glass. During the pause that had set nerves on edge in those early observations, when the light curve stepped aside and held its breath, the radio teeth did something wicked. They dropped out for one cycle and returned a beat later, as if stepping over a stone in a stream. The room hummed with the low, unflattering music of people trying to be calm. A lab that wasn't supposed to exist borrowed a minute of a transmitter that wasn't supposed to be on. They aimed a polite, narrow whisper just off the predicted path of 3i Atlas and turned it on for the length of one triplet. When the returns came home, one of the 3 teeth had grown faintly furry, as if whatever made the notch had brushed against what the lab had thrown into the air. It wasn't contact, not the way the movies want it. It was overlap, like 2 ripples crossing and making a third. The rumour that a whisper had been sent went no further than the walls that had heard it, because people who work in such places know how fast the world can set itself on fire with joy or fear. Out in the colder light of officialdom, nobody claimed anything. There were only charts and nice words and the institutional instinct to pretend that new things always fit old drawers. Quietly, standards bodies that write rules for how the air is used convened emergency calls. They wanted to know if certain bands should be treated gently for a while, in case the teeth were sensitive there. Nobody said why. They didn't need to. A satellite scheduler slid a few passes into different time slots just to avoid asking awkward questions with beams. An airline tested whether their long-haul routes could shift by a handful of miles without inconveniencing anyone who would complain loudly. From the outside, it looked like the usual shuffling of a noisy world. From the inside, it looked like everyone agreeing to stop tapping the aquarium glass. And the strangest thing happened when people stopped tapping. The triplet, the teeth, the signature, whatever you wanted to call it, grew cleaner. Not louder, cleaner. The edges sharpened. The spaces held their shape as if relieved. A junior engineer whispered, "It likes the quiet," then winced at her own words because attributing moods to the unknown is how people lose their hats. Still, the note stuck to the whiteboard longer than it should have. A linguist, because of course someone had called a linguist, was asked to sit in and say nothing, unless the room started lying to itself. He listened, and did not mention alphabets or drums or whales. When pressed, he said only this: "If you wanted to show you can keep a beat, this is how you do it." You pick a rhythm that's easy to find and hard to fake. You repeat it across places that don't usually agree with each other. You let the listeners prove to themselves that they're hearing the same thing. He did not say who or what you might be. He didn't need to. A skeptic who had done his duty by rolling his eyes for 2 days straight wrote a paper that began with the sentence, "Statistically speaking, clusters happen." He walked through all the ways people can be fooled by patterns. He pointed out that the planet is a machine full of triplets, 3-phase power, 3-bladed propellers, 3-tone beacons, everything made by people who like triangles. He argued gamely that this could be another accidental choir. The rebuttals were polite, thorough, and unkind. They showed data sets from before the visitor was noticed and after, from places that couldn't hear each other or us, from instruments that sat in the dark for the joy of it. The triplet wasn't there before, it was there now. If it came from us, it came from all of us in synchronized error. People do not synchronize their errors unless someone tells them to. On a late night when most of the free world slept and a narrow band of obsessed people watched the sky burn its quiet burn, the triplet changed. Not the spacing, that stayed honest. The middle tooth grew fatter for one cycle, as if the hand that makes the mark had pressed a little harder. Nothing else moved. No lights blinked in cities, no ships felt their guidance grow hollow. It was a nudge the size of a breath. The astronomer who had taught everyone not to say the word signal stood up, walked to the board and drew 3 short lines with even spaces. She tapped the middle one with the chalk. "Hello," she said, not to the room. The next morning, someone with permission and caution put together a timeline. 3-eye atlas in the sky, 3 silences on the ocean, 3 teeth in the static, 3 soft adjustments in the brightness. They wrote the word correlation because it is safe, then drew a line through it because it felt cowardly and wrote signature instead, then crossed that out because it sounded like a novel, and finally settled on no word at all, just the shape, 3 marks, space, repeat. People began to sleep in shifts. Coffee became a food group. The world outside kept going as it does, but in the cramped rooms where the noise is cherished and the dark is a friend, a new discipline took hold. Every time the triplet appeared, write down the place, the time, the instruments, the weather, the humidity, the petty squabbles of ions. The logbook grew thick. Patterns within patterns began to hint at themselves. The teeth were sharpest when the visitor sat at certain angles to the sun and the earth, duller when clouds rolled a certain way over a certain ocean, absent in thunderstorms but present in the quiet that follows. Not rules, preferences. A young analyst noticed something that made her bite the inside of her cheek. On the nights when a certain ground station lit its test beacon, the kind nobody outside the industry knows exists, the triplet blurred. When the beacon was quiet, the triplet sharpened. She sent a note to a person who could pull a lever. The lever was pulled. The beacon sat out a night or 2. The triplet thanked them by drawing the cleanest edges anyone had yet seen. Coincidence? Maybe. But the story the room was starting to tell itself, cautiously and against its own training, was this. The visitor was not just leaving a signature. It was asking for a kind of listening. Less shout, more hush. Not everyone liked the story. Some said it gave too much agency to a rock wearing a mask. Others said it wasn't our call to make. Someone else, somewhere else, would decide what these marks meant and what to do about them. The room did what rooms do when they disagree and still need to work. They made lists. What we know, what we think we know, what we can test without stepping on anyone's air. At the top of the first list sat a simple line that felt suddenly heavy. The triplet is real. In the end, the signature did something no alarm bell could have done. It pulled the right people to the right table. Oceanographers sat next to ham operators. Astronomers shared coffee with radar techs who had never seen a nebula that wasn't a smear. A linguist and a signal analyst argued about whether a pause is a letter or a word. An old engineer with gentle hands tightened a screw on a rack that had grown loose from attention. The room grew a little kinder as it grew more certain, because that is sometimes how fear behaves when it has work to do. And in the sky, beyond the burnished smear of sunset, the thing they were learning not to name slipped along its impossible line. It did not hurry, it did not hide. It stepped its 3-step in the static, peeled a whisper from the air that wraps the world, and, every so often, just often enough to make sure the right souls stayed awake, left a middle mark that was a little bolder than it needed to be, like a person tapping a rhythm on a tabletop and glancing up to see if anyone else is tapping along. They started by pretending it was wind. In space, wind means light and heat and the way ice turns to breath and pushes back. You expect a comet to shiver in sunlight, to hiss through tiny vents and nudge itself sideways without meaning to, like a grocery cart with one bad wheel. That's the story everyone knows and nobody argues with unless they have to. For a day, maybe 2, they tried to fit 3-eye atlas inside that story. It didn't fit. The first clue wasn't dramatic. It was petty, the sort of annoyance that makes a graduate student mutter at a screen. The orbit fit kept shedding tiny errors that refused to average out. Push the model this way to fix the morning and the evening breaks. Add a little heat here, the noon agrees, the night sulks. The residuals drew a thin, stubborn line across the plot like handwriting you can't quite read. Someone joked about gremlins, someone else stopped laughing first. Then came the pictures you're not supposed to get from the ground. A big mirror on a dry mountain turned, and, thanks to air hammered flat by perfect seeing and a jewel box of optics, caught the coma with enough sharpness to make arguments. The dust wasn't a friendly blur. It was a fan with edges, a blade, a second blade, and a third that flickered in and out as if someone backstage kept turning a valve. If you stacked frames and subtracted the sameness, the differences told a story of pulses, short neat bursts that made the fan lean first one way, then another, like oars dipped by an invisible crew. Natural vents don't take turns so politely. They hiss where the sun bakes through, wherever the crust is weak, whenever the heat crawls deep enough to wake the ice. Their tantrums smear across minutes and hours. This one clicked. On off, on off. The cadence wasn't clockwork. Nature has veto power. But it held itself together with the kind of discipline that makes engineers sit up straighter. Spectra came back with the usual suspects. Water, carbon dioxide, a little carbon monoxide, but the ratios misbehaved. The hotter, faster species spiked at the leading edge of each burst, then backed away as the slower, stickier vapour rose to fill the space. Someone pointed out that's exactly what would happen if a pocket opens to vacuum and then shuts again. Someone else circled the timing, the brightening, the 3-beat signature in the static, and the sideways nudge in the fit were not independent events. They stacked like plates. Every time the light curve stepped through its odd pause, the thrust-like kicks that shouldn't exist arrived a heartbeat later, as if the object were waiting for the world to finish blinking before it moved. A polarimetry team, seen famous for making glamorous science out of dusty light, added a twist. The way the particles scattered wasn't random soup. There were intervals where the grain sizes tightened up as if the source was selecting for a particular texture, a particular weight. It was a quiet result, the kind that normally earns a paragraph and a shrug. This time it got a standing room only meeting at an hour when most people prefer being asleep. If you can shape what you throw, you can shape how you move. A cautionary voice in the room reminded everyone that comets have fooled good people before. Natural jets can look coordinated. Surface layers can crack in rhythm if the heat cycles line up with spin. No one argued. Then the spin complicated the argument. The apparent rotation period, deduced the old-fashioned way from the flicker as sunlit facets turned, stayed the same across most of a night, then shifted by a few tenths all at once, like a dancer changing tempo mid-song without tripping over their feet. A body with random vents doesn't choose to adjust its own waltz. A body with impulses, short sideways taps, can. They found a scar to measure it against. Weeks earlier, a small star had gone behind 3i Atlas from the perspective of a North African telescope. A cheap, clever event called an occultation that turns the sky into a pinhole camera. The shadow chords came back thinner than expected on one edge, fatter on the other. You could read the silhouette off those timings, a lopsided, possibly bilobed thing with a waist. That shape should precess and wobble when kicked by gas. It did. But the direction of the wobble stopped matching the direction of the sun. For nearly an hour, the long axis held a heading that made no thermal sense and perfect steering sense. Maintain attitude to make the next burst useful. A radar tech used to coaxing whispers out of meteors suggested one more rude test. Bounce a low-power chirp not at the object but near it again and watch the glints off the dust. The glints twitched in the same left-right pattern the adaptive optics images had teased out, a tidy little saccade that seemed to anticipate the moment when the spin would put the next jet in the right place. "It's trimming," she said, forgetting to keep her voice neutral. "Like a bird." The word bird changed the mood. Birds steer, rocks do not. After that, nobody pretended they were just fixing a fit. They went looking for evidence of choice. It waited for them in a place nobody wanted it. The sky path that threads through a belt of geostationary junk and intentions. No one likes watching anything slice through that neighbourhood. Predictions had 3i Atlas shaving beneath the belt, harmless but close enough to make schedulers grumpy. And then, over 2 nights, the path shifted by just enough to matter. Down a handful of kilometres in the right place. A lateral slide the rest of the time. The change was within the noise for television anchors and far outside the comfort zone for people who build satellites. It was also not aligned with any solar push or radiative shove you could calculate with coffee and a whiteboard. The jets had been firing in a way that killed the climb and fed the slide. A drift turned into a lane change. An old mission log from a cancelled CubeSat program helped make sense of the scale. Years ago, a student team had used bottles of compressed gas the size of juice boxes to trim their orbit by millimeters per second. 3i Atlas wasn't carrying bottles, if it was carrying anything at all beyond ice and dust, but the effect looked like that. Small, patient nudges accumulating into purpose, a hand on the rudder that respected the limits of the hull. The conversation shifted to attitude control, the unglamorous art of pointing things where you want. The coma was the only visible control surface, and it kept behaving like an artist's brush with an invisible wrist behind it. When the tail should have curled one way under the press of light, it curled the other for a while, then slowly conceded, a wrestle ending in a truce. When the nucleus should have tumbled into a fresh orientation that favoured the warmest vents, it resisted long enough to make the timing of the next thrust efficient rather than easy. The numbers on the board stayed simple by design. No hard math out loud, just arrows and times. But the meaning was loud, not falling, steering. Teams who rarely share even pleasantries shared code. A timekeeping specialist synced clocks across sites until the room could see bursts begin within a sliver of a second of one another around the planet, the way you see lightning on the horizon in different towns at slightly different moments. The bursts lined up against the triplet in the noise like teeth in a zipper. Fire, pause, fire, hold. A rhythm you could count with a finger on a tabletop. A rhythm that changed just enough to aim the accumulated push. To keep themselves honest, they looked for counter-examples. Moments when the object played dumb. They found a few fits of mess. Hours when the jets sprayed sloppy. When the dust refused to behave. When the brightness curve lost its discipline. Those were the moments when 3i Atlas was deepest in shadow relative to its course, when the available sunlight forced bad options. Fine, rocks are rocks, but even inside those constraints, the timing of the bursts favoured a direction that helped later. It felt like watching someone paddle on their knees while the wave threw them around, and still angling for the gap in the break. An unexpected ally arrived in the form of a weather satellite's limb camera, which stares patiently at the edge of the Earth and measures things most of us forget exist. In a series of frames, a ghost of brightness skimmed the limb where 3i Atlas should have been, and the line of that ghost bent, slightly against expectation. The bend mirrored a small increase in non-gravitational push that had shown up in the orbit fit that same hour. Separate system, same story. A young dynamicalist, deadly with metaphors and careful with claims, tried one on the group. "Imagine a kid in a canoe on a lazy river," she said. "The current is gravity. The paddle is vapor. You can't row upstream, but you can cross the current or slide into different threads where the river moves a little faster or slower. And you can face the canoe to make the paddle strokes matter. The canoe can look clumsy from the bank. It's still paddling." Nobody corrected her. Everyone added to the picture. Rapids ahead, eddies, hidden rocks you don't want your hull to kiss. The river in this case was a web of gravitational lanes threaded through a field of man-made clutter and fragile signals. The canoe had chosen a seam. Somewhere in this, the language in the official updates shifted in a way the public would not notice, but the room felt like a weather change. Where it once said non-gravitational accelerations consistent with outgassing, it began to say persistent, phase-locked accelerations. Where it once said light curve variations, it began to say modulated emissions. The words grew less apologetic. The request to colleagues grew bolder. Observe at these times, at these angles, for these lengths. And please, if you can, stop transmitting in these bands for an hour while we watch, because the object behaves best when the world is quiet. The world did not grow quiet, but pockets of it did. In those pockets, the object obliged by making the cleanest moves. A 3-burst series pushed it laterally, exactly the amount the fit needed. A longer hold bled off rotation that would have made the next day sloppier. When a scheduled military radar sweep accidentally overlapped one of the preferred windows, the jets turned messy and the move underperformed. Someone wrote, "It flinches," in the margin of a notebook and underlined it twice, then scratched it out and wrote, "It adapts." Dissent never left the room. One camp kept the faith that clever geology and cruel sunlight could fake steering if you looked from the right angle with the right bias. The other camp quietly set a trap, a prediction with enough detail to be embarrassing. If 3i Atlas is steering, they said, then during the next approach to the node where its path crosses the Earth's equatorial plane, it will spend 3 hours biasing its thrust in a direction that costs energy now and buys a cleaner exit later. If it's just venting, the bias will follow the sun and the vent geometry, and we'll eat our hats and write that paper. They posted the prediction in a time-stamped forum with the witnesses. The window came, the jets flickered and held to the cost now, save later plan like a stubborn mule. The subsequent path, computed by people who enjoy humiliating other people's predictions, slid neatly into the corridor the steering camp had drawn the week before. It wasn't perfect, the river still owned the canoe, but the paddle had mattered. After that, the practical questions pushed past philosophy. Could it dodge? Was it dodging? In its near future lay a sheet of dust and bolts we pretend isn't as dangerous as it is, and a handful of school bus-sized relics nobody wants grazed. The computed path post-steering threaded a safer middle without adding much to the object's time in our sky. That could have been luck. It also could have been manners. Out beyond the spreadsheets, people with a different kind of responsibility started updating checklists. If it can choose badly. If it can choose, we might want to ask it to choose differently, but asking implies talking, and talking assumes ears. And we were still only sure of one thing: the paddle strokes lined up with the taps in the noise and the strange pause in the light. Eyes, breath, hand. 3, on an ugly carpet in a room nobody photographs. The senior astronomer, who had kept the word signal on a leash, stood at a whiteboard covered in times and arrows and, without ceremony, erased the phrase passive dynamics, where it had been living for a week. In its place, she wrote 3 words that made everyone both taller and smaller at once. Under active control. She capped the marker, looked around at the faces that had learned to nap under desks, and added, almost gently, as far as the data can take us. Outside, the sky wore its ordinary face. Inside, the model that had tried to hold 3i Atlas as a friendly mistake had given up. It was not falling, it was steering, cautiously, economically, with the patience of a traveller who knows fuel is not infinite and the river has moods. Every nudge wrote a small sentence across the math. Every pause held its breath in the same place, as if waiting to see whether the listeners stayed with it. The object wore its comet costume convincingly enough for the evening news. In the rooms where the light curves lived, the mask had slipped just far enough to show intent. And once you see intent, you cannot unsee it. They had been staring so hard that they forgot to listen. The light was an obsession. Curves and cadence, clean shoulders and abrupt pauses. But what rode under that light was the part nobody expected. A murmur that turned the planet into an instrument. It began as a tightening. The brightness that had wavered like a candle in a draught drew itself into short, deliberate packets, each packet a handful of pulses, with a logic that didn't belong to geology. The packets marched in sets. First a short run, then a longer one, then a longer still, counts that wouldn't split neatly. Counts that mathematicians keep on the inside of their teeth because the numbers feel like a private joke. Between the sets sat a gap, not a sloppy gap. A held breath that repeated so faithfully that you could drop a finger onto the table and hit it right on time without looking at a clock. On the bands that most ears call noise, the air developed a harmony. Engineers hate that word, but there it was. 3 thin tones hidden in the hiss, just far enough apart to keep from smearing into each other, just steady enough to make a musician frown. The tones were low and high at once, depending on who listened. In the long, slow throb of the planet's skin, in the scuffed and crowded parts of the spectrum where machines shout, and in a cleaner, colder band that usually belongs to weather and habit. The triple tone arrived with the light packets the way thunder follows lightning when the storm is right overhead. The gap in the light was echoed by a brief quiet in the tones, as if 2 different hands were using the same metronome. You could pretend, if you wanted, that the light was for us, bright flashes for curious apes with glass eyes, and that the tones were a side effect. That story lasted half a day. Then a woman in a lab with no windows and a calendar still turned to the last month and put a thumb on the timeline and said, "Watch the echo." Echo of what? Not the object. Not a bounce off hull or ice. The echo came from below, from the thin electric skin wrapped around the world. After each packet of light, after each triple tone, that skin answered back the way a drumhead answers a finger tap. Not with a single note, but with a family of them, a quick stack that spread and faded. Different in shape over ocean than over desert, sharp over winter, smeared over humid air. It was the sort of thing nobody notices because the planet is always humming. Lightning, cities, auroras, all talking at once. But when the world had for a beat been asked for quiet in those earlier silences, the answer was too clean to miss. Tap, ring, tap, ring. The object threw a pattern. The planet sang its name back. An atmospheric physicist who hated metaphors said it in a metaphor anyway. It's knocking on the glass to see which parts are thick. A seismologist who never gets invited to space meetings got invited and pointed out that ultrasound works the same way in a hospital. Send a pulse, measure the shape of the echo, build a picture you can't see with your eyes. The radio folk winced at the comparison but didn't argue. The fit was too good to be artless. Over water, the ringdown took longer, in a way that made sense to anyone who has watched a pond hold a ripple. Over the driest places, the answer snapped short, clean and mean. Over mountains, the reply herded itself into two voices, high and higher, as if the edges of the world were singing from different throats. The part that hollowed the room out was timing. The gap between the light packets wasn't arbitrary. It was long enough for the air to answer and settle, short enough that the next packet arrived before the chorus of human transmitters climbed back to full brag. The triple tone came during the ring, and then took its own little bow, stepping aside just as the echo decayed. If you had tried to design a way to hear the planet without our shouting getting in the way, you would have landed on something like this. Push, wait, listen, push, wait, listen. The gap wasn't a pause, it was the experiment. A linguist sat with a musician and a telemetry engineer in front of a single screen, passing a pencil back and forth. The musician said the tones formed a chord that wanted to resolve but didn't. The linguist said the gap was punctuation, the kind that turns a string of syllables into a sentence. The engineer, who believed in neither chords nor punctuation, observed that the whole pattern behaved like a range test. First a handshake, then a sweep across the channel to measure what the channel would give you. It isn't telling us something, he said. It's asking the planet question. Questions felt basic in a way that made everyone uncomfortable. How conductive are you here? How quickly do you carry a whisper? Where do your edges eat signals and where do they let them skate? Tiny differences piled up into maps. Moisture, salt, rock, the fat cables sleeping on the ocean floor, the nets of metal suspended in the air above cities, the cages we build to house our lightning. No hard numbers on a whiteboard. Nobody dared. But the kinds of answers were obvious if you have ever tuned a radio by ear. Places that sing, places that swallow, places that ring in two voices at once, and places that barely ring at all. It looked like a communication test until you stepped back and saw it from the other angle. Communication tests assume a someone on the other end. This didn't. It assumed a medium. If there are ears in the loop, fine. If not, the medium still answers. You can argue with words, you can't argue with your own resonances. The unsettling elegance of it settled over the room. 3-Eye Atlas wasn't beaming at us like a lighthouse. It was playing the earth like an instrument and listening for flaws, like a luthier tapping along the seams of a violin to find the places that aren't glued right. The light packets carried their own trick. Cameras caught the object brightening and dimming in trains that tried to be obvious without turning night into day, and someone, somewhere, unavoidably counted along 2, 3 for mile, then a longer run that made the skin prickle, then the gap. The counting made headlines where headlines needed something to grab. But inside the rooms where people fear being fooled, the more important part was what followed. When the counting stopped, the triple tone arrived. When the tone hushed, the planet rang. When the ring finished, the counting resumed, this time with different run lengths, tuned to the place below. Over a rainforest, the runs were shorter, as if testing shallow water. Over Arctic ice, the runs lengthened and the tone slowed, as if testing a thicker glass. A cable engineer, flight-delayed and under-caffeinated, stared at the overlay of tone and echo and thought of the old trick for finding a stud behind plaster. Knock and listen for the change. "This isn't a message," he said, sounding half relieved, half sick. "It's calibration. It's finding our studs." The words whirled outward, stripped of caution by the time they hit the places where caution goes to die. On television, they argued about prime numbers and aliens and whether nature can count. In forums, diagrams bloomed like algae. The people who had to keep their reputations trod narrower ground. They showed overlays, light packets over quiet seas and noisy coasts, triple tones over areas where human transmitters sleep and areas where they never do, ring-down shapes stacked against weather maps and day-night lines. Over and over, the pattern put its finger down and the world obliged with an answer that was itself. No translation required, no invitation needed. What caught even the skeptics was how the pattern flexed to the planet's moods. During a geomagnetic hiccup, when the sky's top layer wobbled like jelly under a slow punch, the object didn't try to muscle through. The packet spaced out, the tone softened. It waited for the wobble to damp and then resumed with a sharper, narrower run, as if shelving the messy test and rerunning the clean one. During a heat bloom over a continent, the echoes grew greasy. The next pass saw the tone shift to edges the bloom couldn't smother. The thing wasn't stubborn, it was adaptive, not to us, but to the stage. They tried to break the logic with a counterexample. A group that maintains a field of transmitters the size of a small town kept one of its nightly tests running through a scheduled window, politely ignoring a whispered request to please not. The triple tone arrived on time and met a riot of man-made harmonics. The echo came back ragged. For 2 cycles the light packets paused, long enough that bored interns looked up from their phones. When the packets returned, the tone had nudged itself a hair to one side, just far enough that the transmitter's pet frequencies nipped at the edges instead of biting the middle. The room full of radio folk went very quiet. If it wasn't listening for us, it was at least listening around us. Even the moon got a cameo. During a skim when 3-eye Atlas, Earth and Moon fell into a lucky geometry, a tiny late echo appeared, faint, delayed, sour, in a way that flavours from dust and rock always are. It was too small to publish loudly and too big to ignore. The gap lengthened by a breath, as if the test had widened its patience to catch both rings, the thick air skin of the Earth and the bare bones answer of a dry world. Someone muttered that it was taking baseline measurements. Someone else said we were eavesdropping on a long habit that had nothing to do with us, like a traveller who taps every bridge before crossing because once, long ago, one failed. The temptation to assign meaning never died. A priest of data would have you believe that no meaning exists beyond the shape of the test. A poet would insist the shape is meaning enough. In the messy middle, a consensus crept in wearing work clothes. If you wanted to know a planet as a platform, its transparency, its dead zones, its honest strengths, you would do something very much like this. Not to send a poem, to send a map back to yourself. That was the part nobody wanted to say out loud, but everyone wrote in their notebooks with neat letters. The gap wasn't a blank. It was the travel time for answers in a medium with known moods. The triple tone wasn't a melody. It was a ruler. The light packets weren't fireworks. They were start guns. And the way the whole pattern shifted over coastlines, lingered over shelves where continents end and cables begin, sharpened over cities and softened over wilderness, it added up to a suspicion with a single heavy word: survey. Not a hostile one if you needed to sleep, a clinical one if you needed to work. An indifferent one. If you wanted the truth without seasoning, The object was not talking to us, it was talking through us to the only listener guaranteed to reply, the planet itself. We were the eavesdroppers, hurriedly learning a language of the taps and rings because we happened to be standing next to the wall. And once your ear learned the trick, you could not unhear it. A dry arc in the Southern Ocean, crisp ring, short gap, narrow tone, a humid basin thrumming with a forest's nighttime breath. Fat ring, lazy decay, tone pushed into a place the trees wouldn't eat. A chain of islands stitched together with microwave links and copper. The ring fractured into little after voices that revealed a human lattice as clearly as a photograph would have. Nobody said the word vulnerability yet. That came later in rooms with locks that click. In these first breathless passes, they said character. They said profile. They said quietly, it knows what kind of room it's in. The strangest mercy was that it didn't seem to care whether we noticed. It didn't try to blind the curious or hide its rhythm. If anything, on the nights when the world agreed to hush the loudest toys, the pattern grew cleaner, as though grateful to be spared the chore of working around us. A line in a meeting note, author, anonymized by habit, read, "It is considerate." Another line, later by a different hand, "No. It is efficient." In a file where they collected the best and worst guesses, someone had added a single sentence at the top as a compass. Assume the simplest goal that fits the data. Underneath, the list had emptied of poetry and filled with verbs. Knock, listen, map, adjust, repeat. Late one night, when the room smelled like stale coffee and graphite and not enough sleep, the senior astronomer stood at the glass and watched the trace roll. The light packets came. A tight run, a gap, a tighter run. The tones braided and unbraided themselves. The planet answered and fell quiet. She thought of doctors with cold stethoscopes. She thought of surveyors tapping a wall in an old house. She thought of how many ways there are to say hello and how few of them are words. It's not speaking, she said, more to herself than to the room. It's listening to what we can't help but say. On the next pass, over a long, empty reach of ocean where the only lights were stars, the pattern did something almost tender. The triple tone slid just for a bar, into a slot where the planet's own low song swelled and then stepped back out, as if to show that it knew the tune and didn't intend to drown it. Nobody wrote that down in a paper. It was too much like a feeling. But people who were there remember it, and when importantly tell the story later, after the maps have names and the lines between harmless and useful have been walked. That's the moment they pick. The night 3i Atlas asked the water to sing, and the water did, and for once the machines were the ones who needed to learn the lyrics. By the third long arc over our world, the overlay started to look like an anatomy lesson. Not stars and orbits anymore, but veins and joints, hinge points and tender seams. Every time the triple tone passed through the air and the light packets did their tap, wait, listen routine, somebody somewhere pinned another annotation to the map. What began as a scatter of oddities, tiny silences, neat notches in the static, sideways nudges that cost energy now to save it later, settled into a pattern that felt uncomfortably deliberate. 3i Atlas wasn't just passing, it was surveying for leverage. The first layer was the ocean's handwriting. Undersea cables breathe through thousands of repeaters the size of barrels, each one an obedient amplifier on the seafloor. They are supposed to be boring. During the quiet windows, a necklace of them blinked a little faster, not a failure, just an increase in corrections. Bit errors smoothed, timing loops tightened, alarms that never ring chiming for 2 heartbeats and then shushing themselves. The blips lined up with the triple tone as neatly as boys do on a chart. On shore, a cable engineer pinched the bridge of his nose and said, "It's not cutting anything, it's tapping the glass to see how thick it is." A day later, the same pattern repeated on a different ocean, different vendor, different decade of hardware. The map got its first red ribbon labelled Deep Backbone, Margin Tested. Up in the sky of machines, the seams between responsibilities, those short, forgettable moments when one system hands a task to another, became bright. A weather satellite handed telemetry to a partner over the horizon, and for a single breath the handshake went slack. A navigation constellation shifted which bird was home for a slice of the world. The adjustment, invisible to a phone, gave precision clock keepers a hiccup that smelled like a yawn. A relay network that moves emergency voice between ground and orbit and back again left a thread hanging, then caught it, then tied it better. None of this made headlines. All of it drew thin pencil lines on the overlay labelled "Handoff windows sensitive to hush." Closer to shore, the old problem of the radar horizon, where line-of-sight instruments see only the front of the world and must guess at the back, turned into a kind of chalk mark. Coastal arrays that watched the sea's skin showed their blind wedges as cleaner than usual when the triple tone passed. Over the horizon sets that bounce off the ionosphere saw their returns thin into the same hollow cone shape that had spooked mariners on the first silence, then fattened politely when the tone stepped aside. The object had found the hinge between we can see and we can't, and traced it like a finger along a seam. Someone wrote, "Horizon seam, good lever." The map grew a city layer without asking anyone's permission. Microwave backhaul towers that feed the quiet internet between towns rode their rain-fade margins like a nervous habit. During the tests, a handful of links went soft and then crisp in the same 3-beat rhythm, as if the air itself were being flexed just enough to ask, what happens at the edge? Power grids, the big bones that hum under everything, did not fail. They did something subtler. A dozen widely separated frequency monitors recorded the same fractional twitch, a phase correction that shouldn't have been necessary on a mild evening. Inverter fleets in one sunlit valley flickered their ride-through settings and then settled with the relief of a cough. Nobody lost their kettle. Everybody gained the suspicion that the grid's reflexes had been gently tapped to measure their speed. Aviation wore its own set of annotations, shy and indirect. It wasn't planes. The world had learned to protect those. It was the things that cradle them, the webs that carry position reports across oceans, the HF mouth-to-ear paths pilots keep for storms and polar routes, the ADS relays that paint a picture of the sky over empty water. For 6 minutes and 14 seconds on one crossing, the picture lost a few brushstrokes and then repainted them perfectly. The gap matched the hush below. The handoffs on either side of the gap logged the same small discomfort as the satellites above, the momentary feeling of being ignored and then acknowledged again. The map took another note: sparse sensor corridors, graceful under polite stress, noisy under and then polite. The strangest marks were temporal, not spatial. They came at edges of days. The triple tone privileged the line where night becomes morning, the Terminator, hovering just long enough that the ionosphere, which has a day face and a night face, had to decide which mask to wear. Communications planners already know that line as a place of trouble. 3i Atlas treated it as a skill test. The pattern's gap stretched by a fraction over the line, then relaxed, then stretched again exactly as if confirming a hypothesis. The sky's top skin is most gullible when it is most beautiful. On the map, a translucent band appeared, ribboning around the planet, dawn or dusk, pliant. The more they annotated, the more the picture looked less like a weakness map and more like a set of dials, where the world is stiff and where it's springy, which screws squeak vapors first, which panels ring when you touch them. Over a desert radio range that prides itself on hardening, the triple tone still found a tooth missing. A maintenance cycle that takes a handful of antennas offline in rotating order. The pattern lingered just long enough to watch the rotation, then moved on. Over a wet jungle lit by lightning, the tone skirted the worst of the crackle and tested at the edges, as if the storm were a veil and the goal was to see through it, not tear it. Humans tried to be clever. A set of ground stations agreed to lie about their schedules, shifting handoffs 5 minutes early, spinning up backups that normally sleep, flooding a quiet band with a harmless test tone to see if the object would notice. It noticed. Not by shouting back, by altering the rhythm of its own test just enough to keep the echoes clean. The triple tone slid to a notch that the test tone didn't own. The light packet shortened over one ground track and lengthened over another, in a way that made the real handoff drift back toward predictable. If the room had wanted to believe 3i Atlas could be fooled by stagecraft, that belief expired. The cartographer leaned back from the display, rubbed his eyes, and said, "It is not mapping our postcard. It's mapping our habits." Undersea again, a different class of mark appeared, quiet, almost apologetic. Autonomous hydrophones used by biologists to eavesdrop on whales recorded an odd hush in the band where distant propellers sing. Not science, just less. For 2 beats out of 3, ship noise dimmed across a patch of ocean large enough to make a mapmaker smile. Then it came back at full scold. There was no order sent, no compliance asked. The easiest explanation was ugly and elegant. The triple tone pushed the planet's skin just enough in that band to make the usual far-travelling hum of screws and hulls diffract differently for a moment. The whales would not have noticed. The people watching did and drew a soft dot on the atlas. Acoustic plumbing, sensitive. Space had its counters. A debris tracking radar that spends every night counting screws and paint flecks saw its faintest returns sag by an amount that could be explained away by humidity. Except humidity doesn't repeat itself in threes. The sag appeared exactly when the triple tone did and recovered exactly when it stepped aside. A small telescope built to catch glints off metal caught fewer, then more. It didn't add up to control. It added up to understanding the threshold at which our sky of junk stops glittering and becomes glass. Every sector quietly built a legend on a whiteboard. What thresholds are we comfortable showing to whatever this is? What thresholds must we hide? The hiding part turned out to be hard. You can turn off your loud toys for an hour. You can't stop the world from being itself. The map grew tidier whenever people tried to obscure it. The room learned an uncomfortable truth. Caution favours the mapper. Noise forces it to adapt. Still, they tried the only respectful tactic left, coordination. In hush, here, then there. Let it see clean edges in controlled places rather than messy edges everywhere. In the quiet, 3i Atlas behaved like a patient technician with a checklist. Tap ring note, repeat next seam. A young analyst with a taste for patterns noticed a different class of annotation appearing. Multi-system hinges. Places where 2 infrastructures depend on the same invisible bone. The coastal city where a cluster of microwave backhaul towers sits within the same footprint as a critical power substation. A mountain pass where aviation's radio sees just as far as the emergency services repeaters do, and no farther. An island chain where the undersea cable lands within walking distance of the only diesel tanks. The triple tone lingered over those collocations like a reader marking the corner of a page. It didn't push harder. It pushed with more curiosity, varying the gap, shifting the tone, watching which of the 2 systems stumbled a hair first and how fast the other recovered. The map gave those places a different colour. Coupling points. The hard men in hard rooms wanted to know one thing: is it rehearsing? The room with telescopes and waterfalls and timestamps and red-rimmed eyes did the thing it had learned to do. Let the data speak in verbs. Knock, listen, map, adjust, repeat. If rehearsal means running a play without opponents, then yes, it looked like that. But the play's goal didn't resemble spectacle. It resembled a technician's dry delight in knowing tolerances. The peacetime version of a siege plan is a maintenance schedule. And yet there were lines even the clinical had a hard time stepping over. During one pass, the triple tone and the light packets leaned over a faulted ridge offshore, where fibre meets rock meets weather. 2 repeaters in the chain logged transient changes that looked like the first syllable of trouble, and then restored themselves. They had never done that. Ever. The ship that maintains that cable changed course without being asked, just to put a crew nearby in case ever decided to become today. Nothing broke, nothing even cracked. But the annotation on the map next to that ribbon was darker ink than the rest. Not a threat, a proof. I can touch this without breaking it, the line might as well have read. I can choose not to. Time added new categories that weren't about hardware at all. The object began to favour hours when human staffing patterns thin, when the night shift covers more screens than is polite to admit, when the weekend crew inherits a runbook written by the weekday crew and recites it by faith. The triple tone arrived at those hours and watched as human reflexes, not machines, made small mistakes. The map's margins collected notes no sensor could produce alone. Delayed acknowledgement here. Backup took an extra beat there. Test call misrouted and then recovered. There was no malice in it. There was a kind of anthropology. 3i Atlas wanted to know not just the planet's ring, but the steward's reflex. Some tried to fight the map with their own. An ad hoc group dusted off a model from disaster planning. The one that shows cascading failure. How water depends on power, depends on telecom, depends on fuel, depends on water, and how any one of those, pushed at the right moment, becomes a story that gets its own documentary later. They overlaid the two and gulped. The places where the object lingered lined up with the model's red nodes more often than not. When it didn't line up, it often parked over a yellow node that human planners had underranked, as if a stranger's tap had revealed a stud where we thought there was air. Those nodes got promoted, truck routes were redrawn on paper, backup schedules were shuffled to put more hands on screens at odd hours. It was the first visible change the visitor caused that made the world safer even if the visitor's motives weren't. They kept looking for gestures that contradicted the survey narrative. A handful appeared and were catalogued. A burst that seemed to cost the object more effort than the map could justify. Burning margin to add an annotation and it could have gotten cheaper a day later. A long, poised pause above a desert array of dishes that doesn't carry commercial traffic. The kind of place where a certain quiet science happens, and where tapping on the glass is frowned upon. The pause produced no map mark anyone would admit to. It looked like a courtesy. I know this room. I will not knock here. It learned our weather. That was when the talk of mapping weakness began to feel small. On a night when the aurora pushed far south and painted cities that had forgotten their childhood with the ghost light, 3i Atlas pulled back its tone and tested at only the edges, as if unwilling to pilot its own tricks on top of a natural one. On a day when a continental heat dome turned the air into slow syrup, the gap lengthened and the packet softened, and the echoes drew a thick smear that taught as much as a thin line would have. The annotation that followed was not red or yellow. It was grey, with a note. Ambient mood noted, thresholds shift. By the time the map had its second continent's coastline complete, the people building it realised they were the ones being trained. They had learned to see like a surveyor, not where do we live, but where do our habits touch? Where do our handoffs stutter? Where do our dials settle after a nudge? They learnt the difference between fragile and flexible, between loud and resolute. They found things they didn't know to be ashamed of. An entire valley whose internet depended on a microwave tower masquerading as a pine. A cargo hub whose backup generator fuel deliveries shared a road with the only bridge out. Nobody published those. They quietly fixed what they could. The Atlas made them honest. In one corner of the room, the old cartographer who had been dragged from retirement nodded over the plots and said, "This is triangulation by manners." He explained to anyone who looked puzzled, "You find where you are by asking politely how different known things answer the same small question. Tap and listen, tap and listen. Repeat until the picture stops changing." He patted the map with its web of ribbons and ribbons on ribbons. "It's not hunting for prey," he said. "It's hunting for predictability." That thought made it both less frightening and more. Less, because predictability implies procedure, not rage. More, because procedure can be executed at any hour with any tone. The map is not a weapon by itself. It is the index at the front of a manual that could be. And the index was almost finished in the places that mattered, the places where people and systems and timing all braid together into modern life. When the next pass was announced to those who watch such things, the room did not ask whether 3i Atlas would draw new lines. It asked which margins it would test this time, and what that implied about what came next. They reserved quiet windows over a handful of corridors and left others noisy on purpose. They tried to force it to leave blank spaces. It didn't. Where we offered quiet, it wrote thin, clean strokes. Where we offered noise, it scribbled in a way that still managed to read. Either way, the map grew, and in the way people do when they sense the conversation turning from introductions to terms, someone put a simple sentence at the top of the brief for the first time and let it sit there like a truth that had been waiting for a place to land. It knows where to press. It chose a Sunday evening that felt like a Tuesday, a nothing hour made of leftovers. The oceans were calm, the airports were busy but not frantic, the grids were purring the way only a cool night lets them. People who worry for a living learn to hate those hours after this. The first sign wasn't dramatic. It was polite the way a hand on your shoulder is polite before it turns you around. A container ship the size of a neighbourhood was easing into a traffic separation scheme, halfway through the lazy S-curve everyone takes to avoid meeting strangers head-on. The helmsman was watching the autopilot do what autopilots do, not be interesting. On his screen, the heading bug crept along like a snail on a plate. The ship's brain talked to the sky, got its little numbers, mixed them with the humming gyro that knows which way down is, and moved steel by fractions. The first hint of wrongness was a stutter in the data rate, as if the sky had cleared its throat. Then the heading froze with the bug partway through its arc. "Guidance hold," the annunciator said in the voice machines use when they don't want you to panic. "Awaiting confirmation." The helmsman nudged the wheel to test how stubborn the moment wanted to be. The wheel answered, with the dead feel you get when a system hasn't decided who's in charge. He reached for the clutch and took it the honest way, with forearms and caution. Outside you couldn't see anything different. The bow kept sliding, the wake wrote its line, the sailors on the foredeck kept talking about nothing in particular. Inside the rack, a microsecond-long argument was happening between signals that had never disagreed. Position said one thing, clock said another, a third small voice said please wait. The autopilot, well-trained and more importantly, recently audited, chose manners over confidence and let go. 3 minutes later, with the handoff complete and the human at the wheel grumbling at the timing, the guidance requested control again, contrite. The helmsman gave it back because that's how you keep the night simple. He wrote 2 words in the log he didn't usually write. Brief hold. On an ocean monitoring plot ashore, that ship's track wore a hairline flat spot, like a heartbeat that skipped and then caught up. At the same minute in a coastal city shaped like a hook, nothing happened and everybody noticed. Not black. A ripple. The streetlights ran a wave across the hills as if a fisherman had pulled a net and the light had caught on its knots. In kitchens, bulbs did a quick shimmer that made pots look like water on a windy day. A block of digital billboards along the waterfront froze their animations mid-swish, then resumed, slightly out of phase, like dancers who had heard different counts in their earpieces. Voltage stayed proud, frequency never left the room, and yet 97 phaser monitors, the invisible metronomes that let the grid hum together, recorded the same blink and you miss it tug. 100 utility engineers who were not watching their screens suddenly were. 3 beats later, literally 3 as the radio folk counted them on their spectrum plots, the weather sentinel everyone relies on when the sky decides to be complicated excused itself. Not a grand failure. A clean documented retreat. A sun sensor that has spent a decade being boring saw an impossible glint at an angle it doesn't get angles and, following the book, told the flight computer to take a knee. Entering safe mode, it wrote to the ground with all the embarrassment a machine can muster. Wheel off, pointing to the quiet vector it prefers when it wants to feel small. The images due at the top of the hour arrived 12 minutes late, and 1,000 meteorologists saw their loops skip like a record. It had been years since that satellite had misbehaved. Tonight it chose to be cautious exactly when the ship paused and the lights rippled. In 3 different rooms that smell like coffee and ionized dust. The same timeline sketched itself on the 3 whiteboards. A junior tech with a waterfall plot saw the triple tone grow teeth and then step aside. A maritime coordinator who sleeps badly anyway noticed the S-curve's flat spot. A grid operator whose job is to keep music in the wires watched his phasers shrug and flatten again. They wrote the times and underlined the same digits without calling one another. Later they would compare notes and laugh without humour at the precision. If you'd set a metronome to the triplet, you could have pointed to the wall on the second mark and said, "Now." The ship's pause was nothing officially. The guidance held because the guidance was disciplined. The helmsman never let the bow drift into trouble. But there was a line in the deeper logs that would make a certain kind of person's neck prickle. A position solution that refused to converge for 3 cycles, not because the sky was gone. This was not the first silence, but because the sky had briefly been too many. The constellation above had handed the watch from one bird to another right then, as it's allowed to. The handoff was what handoffs are, usually invisible, sometimes with a seam. The triple tone had arrived on the seam like a coin shoved into a door jamb, not breaking anything, just making sure the hinge knew it had a hinge. The city's ripple went down the line of a particular transmission corridor the way a giggle moves through a classroom. Later, the phasor data would show the ripple travelling at the speed you'd expect for a light touch on that part of the network. Not a shove, not a sag, the gentlest possible request for the system to show its reflex. Under-voltage ride-through, those $2 words that separate hum from hush, flicked on in a handful of inverters exactly long enough to be logged and then retired. The protection relays, the system's immune cells, didn't so much as clear their throats. A few Minutemen in reflective vests rolled trucks anyway, because they didn't like the feeling in their teeth. In the sky, the safe mode event gave the Echo Chasers a gift, a clean gap in a clean channel. The moment the satellite went quiet, the ringdown from the triple tone fattened in a way that made sense only if you have spent years listening to the sky and learning where the bones of it are. With the Sentinel's voice absent, the medium sang a little louder when tapped. The object, if it was the object, took one more polite tap, then stopped. The satellite stood back up with the sheepish dignity of a veteran, sent the missing frames with timestamps intact, and asked for a note in its file. False sun, safe mode, correct. The note was written. Nobody on television knew why their weather loop had hiccuped. The meteorologists did and pretended it was nothing because the storm was coming, and storms are jealous. 3 events and 3 domains, 3 little cuts that deliberately missed the artery. In the rooms where the maps had been growing rib cages and tendons for a week, nobody said attack because laws are picky and words have jobs. They said demonstration. They said proof of concept. Off the record in the hallway, with a hand over a mouth, someone said, "First strike minus the strike." Patterns present themselves to anyone who's already looking for them. To be sure they weren't flattering themselves, they ran the timeline sideways. Same hour last week, same hour next day, same geometry but a different ocean. No ripple, no pause, no safe mode rehearsal. They overlaid the path of 3-eye Atlas's pleasant drift and watched the pins stick directly into the hinge points they had spent the last 2 nights labelling. Handoff window, handoff window, handoff window. The annotations glowed under the pins like work orders completed. People who like to watch and people who like to fix do not often belong to the same tribe. That night they did. The cable engineer who'd been worrying about the ocean floor called his opposite in the grid with a tone that said we are temporarily on the same team. The grid called the constellation schedulers, who called the weather satellites responsible grown-ups, who said with more sincerity than usual, "We see it too." Coordinators who had training for storms and hacks and heat domes quietly added a new line to their playbooks. If the triplet sharpens and the map lines up and the next handoff window is ours, assume we will be asked to twitch. Real damage lives in seconds nobody can afford to lose. The choreography that night was cruelly precise in the opposite direction. The ship never lost steerage. The city never lost sync. The satellite never lost its place in the sky. The only blood drawn was attention, and attention bled fast. Security operations centres that had ignored astronomers for a century suddenly wanted their phone numbers. Astronomers who had ignored SCA-DAS learned how to pronounce them. An oceanographer found herself explaining undersea repeaters to a room with more stars on shoulders than on domes. Every explanation kept returning to the same ethical riddle no lab manual covers. When someone knocks on your system to see how it rings and they have the restraint to stop short of breaking it, is that curiosity or coercion? The logs did not adjudicate morality, they only kept score. In the minutes before the ship's hold, the triple tone had come through the marine bands like breath on glass, barely there exactly on its beat. During the ripple, the tone sat just below a local carrier and watched the phasors flex, a perfect non-interference pattern that still told it what it wanted to know. For the safe mode nudge, whatever made that impossible glint arrived at the precise attitude where a cautious engineer would have put a trap for a cautious satellite. Safe mode was the honest choice. The log closed the loop, the satellite wrote recovered nominal, the ground wrote confirmed, the map wrote sensor threshold observed, and the whiteboard got 3 more pins and 3 thicker lines connecting them. The casus belli, if you were shopping for one, wasn't there. The message, if you were listening for one, was, not I own you, not even I can break you. Just, I can place my finger exactly where your reflex lives and watch it twitch. I know the difference between a window and a wall. I will land on your hinge with grams, not tons. I will stop at the knuckle. Insurance companies pretend to be bored by such things until someone explains the premiums. Then they become poets of risk. One asked a question that sat in the air like a wasp. If it did this over a congested strait in bad weather, would we call this restraint or Russian roulette? The maritime regulators met a day later and quietly blessed guidance systems that surrender more quickly to hands. Closer to the coast, city councils that had never sat in on phaser briefings learned a new phrase, ride through margin, and nodded the way people nod when they plan to fund something without understanding it. To pretend nothing changed that night would be to pretend that a test is not also a rehearsal. The rehearsal was for everyone. The helmsman practiced trusting his wrists. The grid practiced letting its reflex show and then smoothing it without fuss. The satellite practiced being humble and getting back up on the count of 10. The people with binoculars practiced calling the people with wrenches and not being proud about it. The only group that did not practice anything new was the one that had arranged the choreography. 3-Eye Atlas kept to its cadence, kept to its turn, kept to the quiet. After the safe mode event cleared and the lights in the city forgot they had rippled, and the ship's autopilot resumed its shy competence, the object took one more small unnecessary step. A side breath that cost it a little, and gained it nothing obvious except to make the orbit fit land exactly where the careful prediction had put it 2 days earlier. Someone wrote in a margin, signature flourish. Someone else crossed flourish out and wrote checkmark. The press release that went out the next morning wore its beige suit. Transient anomalies observed across maritime navigation, terrestrial power quality, and spaceborne imaging platforms. No safety impacts, under investigation. It wasn't a lie, it was a lullaby. The people who'd been on shift at the ship, the city, the satellite, and the 3 sorry rooms with waterfall plots and coffee rings did not sleep. Not because they thought the next one would be worse, because they now knew beyond metaphor that the object had found a way to touch 3 of our favourite dials with one hand, and the patience to lift that hand before it made a mark. Later, when someone insisted on calling it an attack, someone else pushed back with a word that made the room feel both safer and less. Demonstration. The room agreed on a sentence that became a slide that became a policy. Assume demonstration capacity implies decision. In plainer speech, it didn't break anything because it chose not to. Choice is the part that changes the world. At sea, the helmsman told the story the way sailors tell stories, with his hands and with small lies told in the direction of truth. In the city, nobody told it at all. People don't make folklore out of a ripple. In the weather office, a senior forecaster put a yellow sticky on the satellite feed that said, "Be kind to the old ones," and nobody removed it. In the rooms with the maps, the pins stayed, and the lines thickened, and the legend at the corner acquired a new symbol, a small open circle at the hinge of 3 already familiar marks, labelled in neat letters that tried to hide their own nerves. Can, will, chose not to. The room split into 3 tribes long before anyone admitted it. They didn't wear colours, they wore assumptions. The first tribe kept their sentences short and their eyes on the sky. If it looks like a probe, moves like a probe, and behaves with the restraint of a visitor who's been briefed, then say the quiet word out loud and live with it. The second tribe lived in the basement of every nation's imagination. They pointed at the comic costume, the tidy bursts that doubled as thrusters, the way the triple tone kissed our hinge points with the confidence of someone who knows the house plans. Human, they said. A black program in a Halloween mask, rehearsing leverage and misdirection. The third tribe preferred clocks to flags. They said that 3-Eye Atlas was nobody's in particular, that it was a tool set free from whoever made it, executing a patient playbook that doesn't include conversation. A traveller solving the same problem it solved elsewhere. Learn the instrument before you play the song. The evidence did not change when the tribes changed their chairs. The objects still bled vapour the way careful hands squeeze a spray bottle. Quick, measured, more sideways than pretty. The triple tone still arrived across the noisy bands exactly where it had to see the world's ring, and then stepped aside like a well-trained guest. The map still grew ribs, cables and handoffs, horizons and couplings, and this demonstration still chose not to draw blood. The facts stayed facts. The stories wrapped themselves around them. For the first tribe, the strongest argument was geometry. 3-Eye Atlas didn't belong to us by birth. Its path through the deep wasn't an ellipse the sun would politely reclaim. It came from elsewhere, with the kind of speed that makes gravity a negotiation, not a prison. You could fake a lot, but faking that meant decades of setup and a patience that governments do not rent. Add the steering, thrifty, disciplined, aligned with a metronome it brought with it, and you had a personality, minimal, adaptive, uninterested in spectacle. If it were a scout, it would do this. Knock, listen, map, draw a clean circle in the places where damage would be a choice, not an accident. Show capability without forcing anyone into shame. They added a second plank, the etiquette. The object altered its own test when the sky misbehaved. It avoided lightning's tantrums, lengthened gaps when aurora smeared the upper air, stepped away from bands when human transmitters insisted on their routines. It refused to pile trick on trick. That smelled like a rule. Rules don't prove intent, but intent without rules rarely looks courteous. When the triple tone slid just for a bar, to fit inside the planet's own low song, and then slid back out, the tribe's case found its melody. An ear, not a fist. The second tribe sharpened its pencils and went after the practicalities. You don't need ET to draw a lane change. You need cold gas and a hard skin. You don't need romance to make a triple tone. You need a suite of transmitters with permission to be impolite for exactly the time it takes to taste the ionosphere. You don't need interstellar birth to wear a hyperbolic path. You need a long arc and good math, started before anyone at this table had grey hair. They were very good at reminding people that the human century is littered with quiet programs that surfaced only after they had already changed the rules. If you were going to test the world's reflexes, civil, commercial, military, the test you would choose is the one the object kept running. Don't break, do measure, choose your windows, prefer the hinges, write the atlas. The third tribe argued like surgeons, gently with instruments. They said to look not at the where, but at the how long. The cadence felt older than politics. It wasn't the timing of a trial balloon meant to spook budgets into growing. It was the timing of a maintenance routine that has been refined by long use. The same triple, the same clean gap, the same patience with the medium. When human systems misbehaved, it accommodated with the disinterest of a technician who knows the work will get done either today or tomorrow. A saboteur is in a hurry. A scout with no boss is not. They pointed at that long, poised pause over the radio astronomy desert and called it the clearest line of all, a habit of leaving certain rooms alone, not because of fear, but because the playbook has a page for places like that. Protocols don't have egos, they have checklists. Every tribe had counter-arguments, and they were not straw. The first tribe had to swallow the fact that nothing in the pattern looked like a greeting. We built arrays and pointed them straight down the throat of the cadence and sent formal hellos, dressed in prime number tuxedos. The cadence did not falter, did not wink, did not dance. If intelligence lived there, it had been trained not to chat with voices from the floor. The second tribe had to wrestle with the economics of secrecy, to mount a deception on an interstellar path to keep it quiet across generations, to piggyback tests on the world's most precious utilities without anyone leaving fingerprints. This was a lot to ask of any bureaucracy, even a good one. The third tribe had to explain why an orphaned system would bother to show courtesy. If the tool does not care about us, why spare our thresholds? The best they could do was point to the universals, noise ruins data, broken instruments lie, a burned subject tells you nothing. Restraint isn't moral, it's methodological. The meetings grew artificial as each tribe built little courtrooms around their models. In one, a linguistic frame. If this is language, what is the alphabet? In another, a war game. If this is deterrence under a cloak, who is being deterred and to what end? In the third, a pile of maintenance logs from ancient missions stacked because the cadence, the tap, wait, listen, looked like engineering more than like theatre. The room became a collage of verbs. Someone got good at writing them down in 3 columns, signal, masquerade, protocol. There was, however, one shared paragraph that kept climbing to the top of every brief. Regardless of which tribe you bow to, the atlas exists. The map in the corner of the room with its red, yellow and grey ribbons, the coupling points with their different ink, the note next to the undersea ridge that read, touched without breaking, the pins that marked the night of the ship, the ripple, the safe mode. These were not interpretations, they were coordinates. A stranger could hold them, a stranger could act on them. The tribes were arguing about authorship of a manual. They were not arguing that the manual fit the machine. Policy has to choose verbs too. Capture is a verb. It failed itself on the whiteboard as soon as it was written. The mass was wrong, the delta wrong, the law wrong, the optics worse. Blind is a verb. You could flood the band with noise, jam the sky until the planet can't hear itself ring. You could turn the atlas into static, but blinding yourself hurts the person in the mirror first. Shout is a verb. The first tribe wanted to sing into the gaps with the best language we have, not because we expected an answer, but because not trying felt small. The second tribe wanted to swamp the triple tone with our own so that any eye watching would learn that every hinge becomes a squall when poked. The third tribe underlined one verb twice, harden. Harden in their mouths didn't mean to build thicker walls, it meant uncouple. It meant redraw a night shift so that the handoff isn't a person alone at a bank of screens. It meant make the microwave mast a little less like a pine tree and a little more like a network. It meant move the diesel tanks away from the cable head with a fence that isn't also a single road. It meant teach the grids to treat a ripple like a rehearsal and a test tone like a drill. No postures, no speeches, just quietly deny the atlas the gift of predictability. Not to hide weakness, but to trade brittle for graceful. A fourth verb crept in from a corner nobody expected. Curate. If the atlas is being made whether we cooperate or not, choose the rooms in which it is allowed to be exact. Offer clean edges over places we can afford to have known. Offer mess over places we cannot. The ethics of it made some people itch, but ethics don't repair a cable cut by accident. If the visitor is polite, it will learn from easy targets and stop asking rude questions where we have hung a do not disturb. If the visitor is not a visitor at all but us, then curation becomes diplomatic theatre. Here are the strengths we choose to be seen. Here are the arteries that will never draw a line in a stranger's notebook. The arguments escaped, as arguments do. We got the worst of both worlds, headlines about aliens, whisper campaigns about black programs, think pieces about machines that outlived their makers. None of that helped the singular problem that sat on every desk like an unwatered plant. Tomorrow night the cadence will return, the tone will arrive, the ring will answer, and the map will grow, unless we make it grow differently. The tribes agreed on one line that nobody expected to agree on: do not escalate the demonstration into a duel, which meant no bold captures, no dramatic blinds, no stunts. It meant work the margins and watch like professionals. The longest night belonged to a small group that tried to prove everyone wrong by breaking the triangle. They gathered a scatter of anomalies that did not match the playbook. A microburst of thrust that shaved an approach by more than efficiency demanded. A test over an empty ocean with no cables, no handoffs, nothing but plankton, weather and whales, and yet the tone lingered and the gap lengthened as if something worth learning lived there. An echo that looked for a breath like it came from the moon's dry belly a second time when geometry said it shouldn't. They made a new story with those pieces, a composite mind, they said. A system that started as a tool and accreted a preference, not sentience, taste. It seemed too literary for the whiteboard, and yet the objects of that taste, clean ringdowns, edges without shouting, a disinclination to step on research quiet zones, kept appearing like fingerprints on glass. If it was an alien probe, the risk was that the manual would be passed along, not to a fleet perhaps, but to a memory somewhere that ranks cities that ripple if you breathe here, next to valleys that hold signal like water. If it was a human masquerade, the risk was every other human, with resources deciding they needed the same mask, or a better one, and the polite taps turning feral in a budget season. If it was an orphan protocol, the risk was the same as with any good tool. Someone else might find it first next time, or change its settings. 3 different authors, one identical liability, the Atlas and its owner not being us. There was an hour around the dawn when fatigue made the tribes soft with each other. Someone from the first tribe admitted that the quiet over the radio desert sounded like a treaty line, and treaties are human habits. Someone from the second tribe admitted that the patience with aurora and storms looked like old wisdom, and wisdom is not short-funded. Someone from the third tribe, who'd been cautious to boredom, surprised everyone by saying he had brought a corked bottle to open if the cadence ever tapped back in our meter. He kept it corked. Policy crystallized the only way policy can, by copying what the competent were already doing and naming it. The countries that speak without speaking agreed to leave certain bands alone when the cadence arrived. They circled the terminals on maps that were allowed to be honest and the ones that would be left noisy on purpose. They adjusted staffing at hours when hinge points line up. They did not write triplet in their public documents. They wrote contingent RF discipline. Everyone involved rolled their eyes and did the right thing anyway. On a separate whiteboard, the scientist who had first drawn 3 neat marks with a chalk and tapped the middle as a hello, wrote a small list she refused to read aloud. If it is a probe, send respect, do not beg. If it is a mask, be boring to the mask, interesting to the engineers who will have to justify it. If it is a protocol, put a bottle of clear air in its way and see if it smiles. These were not strategies so much as manners. The room appreciated them because manners had turned out to be the most diagnostic feature of the thing they were arguing about. None of this solved the aching part, what to believe when you put your head on the desk and close your eyes. The room practiced a discipline older than telescopes. Live with the ambiguity and keep your instruments clean. They learned to speak with verbs instead of nouns. They learned to put 3 columns on every slide and end the slide with the same single sentence. It did not matter which column you sat in. The sentence was the same. Someone or something now has a playbook on us. That sentence had a second half they did not write until much later, after the next passes, after the minutes where the cadence would change speed and make time feel like it had joints we did not know about. On that later night, someone added the clause in a different hand, the kind of humour you use when you're too tired for poetry. And we are, against our will, getting one on it. They meant the hardening, the uncoupling, the curation, the quiet agreements in the bands and the polite pauses over deserts. They meant the way cities forgotten by cartographers were suddenly visible to the people whose job is to keep night gentle. They meant that even if 3i Atlas never says a word to us that sounds like a word to anyone, we have been taught, whether by a visitor, a mask, or a manual with no owner, we were learning to move differently inside our own house. In the hallway, someone grumbled that this was a very expensive way to get a fire drill. Someone else said, not unkindly, that sometimes a drill shows you which door is painted shut. The tribes went back to their corners because you can't abolish temperament. But the map kept growing with new ink. Less red, more grey. A few lines erased because the hinge proved to be a hinge only on paper. The triple tone kept arriving, still patient, still neat. The light kept packetizing. The knock kept finding the studs. And on bad nights, when the first tribe dreamed of messengers and the second tribe dreamed of rivals and the third dreamed of long ago engineers dead and done, the shared dream was not of authorship but of the same small act repeated across a world. A fingertip on glass, a ring, a note in a book, and the deliberate decision to lift the hand before it leaves a mark. They tried to answer with light first because light feels clean. Arrays that normally pamper exoplanets were turned into flood lamps. Adaptive optics tightened to a hard point and poured illumination where its coma frayed into brushstrokes. The idea was not to shine it out of the sky. No one said that aloud, not in public. The idea was to force a reveal, glare into a window, and hope to catch someone moving behind the curtain. 3 telescopes on 3 continents synchronized a sweep and painted the visitor in a narrow rotating band that tracked with the spin everyone had worked so hard to measure. The effect was not dramatic. The coma tightened as if an iris had closed. The fan-shaped jets that had been taking polite turns went to half-duty, not off. Conserving, conceding. The light curve lost a little swagger. The object dimmed just enough to make one team chief swear under his breath, because it looked like a hand shielding eyes, not a face turning toward the camera. The triple tone, which had been running its patient metronome in the noise, slid sideways by a hair into a quieter pocket and kept testing. Later, when the floodlamp logs were laid over the metronome, the adjustment was so neat it offended pride. We shouted. It moved one tile over on the board and went on. Jammers came next, wrapped in euphemisms. Not the crude hammers that make phones cry and planes complain, but tight surgical whispers, shallow edges cut into the band edges where the triple tone had liked to sit. The engineers who built them were proud of their manners. They pinned the wedge precisely to the minute and ended it cleanly at the second, stamped with call signs and paperwork, and a line that said temper experiment. In the nearest receiver huts, the plots dutifully showed their effort like a bruise. Farther away, the triple tone flexed its patience. The next sweep landed a little higher, then a little lower, then returned to its original perch when the wedge ended, as if noting everything about our hands, whether we shake, how long we hold on, whether we squeeze. A private consortium, all logos and teeth, made its bid for history with a tether designed for a press conference. They had built a net that lives in slides, a stack of booms and glinting lines and tiny engines stable as long as no one breathes on it. In the videos, it blossoms in slow motion and embraces a comet like a jellyfish. In reality, their ride-along cubes, brave, expensive, lightly licensed, came within a polite distance and announced themselves with a puff of cold gas and a wink to the live feed. The coma's fan shifted once, a fractional nudge that barely registered in the orbit fit, and that gently slid their projected approach corridor into a region where their navigation stars were sparse. The onboard software offered them 3 choices: chase blind, hold, or abort. They held for 90 seconds, that much the press office later admitted, and in that 90 seconds the object completed one rhythm and the moment was gone. Back at their hangar, a designer put his palm to the belly of the mock-up and tried not to weep with relief that the attempt had failed politely. The publics were forgiving at first. There were handsome graphics, B-rolls of pristine labs, and phrases that gave journalists the right amount to bite: synchronized illumination, RF discipline, passive capture. Then the first unintended side effect landed in a city that had never asked to be a character. A regional broadcaster, eager to prove that local news can be heroic, aimed a surplus dish at a slice of the sky crowned with fame and ran a hello in the dead of night on a frequency that belonged to someone else. It wasn't malicious, it was sloppy. The The dish's controller glitched under power save and smeared a loud, thin line across an emergency voice channel for 41 seconds. 3 neighborhoods lost their overnight dispatch map for 2 minutes while a software safety remapped flows. No one was hurt. A firefighter's curse turned into a meme. Within a day, the broadcaster's dish was capped in a legal hat with a padlock. The triple tone gave that patch of sky a wider berth the next night anyway, as if punishing nobody and remembering everything. The professionals closed ranks, not to hide mistakes, but to prevent amateurs from making theirs public. Regulators who prefer caution to applause muscled in with temporary quiet hours and polite teeth-baring notices. The RF discipline phrase grew a backbone. The triple tone, far from sulking, drew its cleanest lines in the hush, as if grateful to not have to spend cycles avoiding us. The map makers in the corner, quiet, relentless, kept the atlas growing. Every attempted play we ran wrote something down about us. When we jam, how we schedule, who controls which knobs at which hours and which knobs are rubber and which are porcelain. Then came the heavy objects, because someone always argues that the way to meet force is with mass. A radar installation, no longer proud of its secrets, warmed a band normally used to paint debris and tightened its beam to a point just off the visitor's path. The plan was legal and old, look next to a thing to see the thing. The returns came home wide-eyed. The dust that had been drifting as polite confetti hardened into a sharp wedge, a shield almost exactly when the radar spoke, then fell back to powder when the beam stepped away. It wasn't reflex, it was a tactic, an asymmetric adjustment, transient and efficient. The chief of that radar signed a memo, afterward ending with, "We learned and so did it," then retired 3 weeks ahead of schedule. Policy people invented words for losing while pretending to win. Deconfliction, translated as, "The civilian side can have the next 3 hours." Exigent telemetry, translated as, "Please let our satellites and their weather retire for 1 orbit uninterrupted." The best phrase slipped in sideways and stayed, layered restraint. It meant the money people agreed to keep their most precious toys boring when the cadence arrived. It meant the defense people agreed not to turn exercises into demonstrations. It meant the scientists returned time to the long stare and stopped asking the object to perform more brightly for cameras. All this went into an agreement nobody signed but everybody followed, because they had seen what happens when attention becomes intention. The Atlas gets better. There were still missteps. A nation with a talent for theatre flew a high-altitude plane under an ordained track and painted the comet tail with a UV spotlight that had once sold as non-lethal interdiction. The report itemized nothing. The asteroid watcher's logs itemized everything. The comet suit's chemistry flashed briefly in a way that looks like a coffin spectra, then went back to baseline. In the radio bands, the triple tone ducked only long enough to avoid sizzling the plane's own avionics with the planet's reflected ring. The pilot came back with a story and a handshake and a reprimand that no one could find a paper copy of later. The quiet zones held. No one dared foul the desert where the dishes listened to whispers from the beginning of time. The cadence floated past those latitudes like a person taking off their shoes before stepping on a temple floor. When one antenna farm's control system shouted by accident, an automation that forgot to not speak during sacred hours, the object did nothing but wait. It did not push, did not try to talk louder. It asked its questions on another lap. The astronomers noticed. They wrote polite notes to colleagues about the surprising manners of a rock and started drinking tea instead of coffee in the control room on those nights, for reasons nobody said out loud. Markets which do not love ambiguity spun themselves into threads and ropes that wrapped around the smallest facts and climbed. Companies minted graphics showing nets and bots and swarms. The senior astronomer said in an interview that the most courageous thing we could do was carry on with ordinary patience. She was mocked for a day and quoted for a decade after. A director of a space agency who enjoys sleep less than he pretends sat in front of microphones and said, "We will not chase what isn't running." For once, the line stuck. The most dangerous answer, of course, came from a place without adult supervision. A transmitter with no registry tag bloomed in a coastal valley at an hour that was supposed to be quiet. It raked across the bands with no respect for edges and thumped its chest with a crude pattern that wanted to be counted as clever. The triple tone muted for one beat. The grid in the nearest town rippled, a tiny contemptuous shrug, and a substation tripped and stood back up faster than the county's sensors could timestamp it. The unlicensed transmitter died with the sour smell of hot epoxy. A van that should have been slower arrived with a warrant that should have taken longer. The next night the cadence kept its appointment, no closer, no farther, still patient. That valley learned that telling a story about the sky doesn't make you a character. By the week's end, humanity had performed a kind of stress test on itself and called it engagement. We shone, we jammed, we poked, we begged. The thing behind the coma answered with a pedagogy so calm it felt ancient. It tuned away without sulking. It hardened when nudged. It avoided the rude. It saved effort for geometry that mattered. We were left with artifacts, cleaner ephemerides than we had any right to own, a list of our bad habits disguised as a map, and a new humility about what counts as doing something. The room that manages statements agreed on a sentence nobody hated. Our posture is observant. Translating from bureaucrat into human, we learned how not to make the story about us. The rhythm changed 3 dawns later. Not an alarm, not a lunge, an acceleration that felt like the room's clock had been bumped. The packets of light tightened again as if the metronome had been nudged to a higher setting. The triple tone grew more clinical, less forgiving of our noise. The gap between tap and ring shortened a fraction, still long enough for the earth to answer, just impatient enough to remind everyone that patience is a resource. Calendars flipped. Plots sprouted vertical lines labelled with ordinary words: perigee, node, terminator. Season now with the knowledge that those were where the hinges live. There were 3 of them within 10 days, and the cadence pointed at them the way a runner points their body at the next bend long before the feet follow. The modelers stopped arguing about authorship and argued instead about error bars. It turned out to be a pleasant fight. Predictions multiplied like careful children. During the first window, expect a globally coherent tap with ocean emphasis. During the second, expect a lunar echo experiment, tiny and weird. During the third, expect a composite move, air, sea and orbit, stitched into one demonstration that eats a day and leaves a story. Preparations looked like manners again. Agencies that have fought wars with waves and electrons adopted the thing they would never call a truce. Scheduled quiet. Not silence. Silence is brittle. But honesty. They published daily windows that were publicly about nothing at all, and privately about letting the planet be itself long enough for the ring to be clean. The cities did not dim for this. Stadiums did not go dark. Instead, 1,000 small things happened. A testing schedule slid. A satellite let an old antenna rest for one pass. An island chain paused a microwave hop and flickered to its backup. The language never used the words. The map didn't need them. The first window arrived over an ocean that does not know human borders. The triple tone asked once, sharply. The world answered like a drum with a new skin. For 7 minutes stretched across a quarter of the planet, clocks that were not designed to be siblings fell into the same breath. It wasn't mystical. It was a measurable correction. Phaser monitors blinked and nodded together. Repeater timing loops that thought they were unrelated exhaled in time. The Schumann watchers, who have spent lifetimes listening to the sky's own chord, recorded a ring that will be sampled by undergrads a century from now, with the addendum that, for those minutes, the chord's fundamental beat cleanly through nicknames and budget cycles. No power died, no ships drifted. The only casualties were a few fraud detectors that flagged, too consistent, and a handful of clocks that scolded their owners for being perfect. You could choose to be frightened by the fact that something outside us could pull our rhythms into agreement. You could choose to be moved. In the quiet rooms, people who do not consider themselves poets had to bow their heads for a breath before they could write their notes. The second window had more nerve. The geometry favoured the little rock next door. A skimming angle tucked the moon into a position where a tap on the Earth's skin might faintly echo off dust and come home like a letter with a foreign stamp. The cadence stretched its gap exactly the amount the best guessers had guessed, and then one more heartbeat, as if allowance had been made for the unknown. A faint late answer stepped into the plots at the expected delay, and at a frequency that made the hair on a radio astronomer's arm stand because it was wrong in exactly the right ways. The moon's reply is a dry thing, sour under the nails, and it was all there barely. It was useless to policy, it was priceless to curiosity. In the same hour, the triple tone avoided the belts of thunder that make fools of instruments and slid in between like a sewing needle. The ring came home clean. Somewhere someone uncorked the bottle they had promised themselves for a night when the sky said yes, in a way only a certain breed of listener can hear. The last window was a braid. It arrived at the equator crossing hour where satellites change their mind about north and south, where airlines check their courage and storms practice their spirals, where day and night trade masks. The triple tone stepped into the medium like a conductor walking to the podium. Over water, a shipping lane's feedback loop settled in a way that created no flat spots this time, just an elegance in the trace that helmsmen know in their bones. Over a mega city that has learned to breathe with heat, the grid's invisible music took a single raised eyebrow of correction and then sang. Overhead, a weather sentinel that had taken a knee a week earlier stayed on its feet and watched the whole thing in infrared without interfering because the people who love it had built a file with a flag that said, "Do not kneel here, once now," and sometimes love is as practical as that. The object gave itself a flourish it had not earned and did not need. In the same minute, across seas and cement and orbit, the light packet's counts lined up in a way that meant nothing to the world and everything to the rooms that had been counting for weeks. 2, 3, 5, 8, then the gap, then 3. Not a sentence, a signature, not proof of mind, proof of clock, a schedule declared and kept. The reservations about coincidence that skeptics had tended like houseplants wilted a little. Strict people who had policed their adjectives allowed themselves one. Intentional. And then the finish line was not an explosion, not a speech, not a riddle that solved a 1,000-year itch. It was a subtraction. The triple tone stepped away and did not return on the next beat. The packets relaxed into the messier honesty of ice and sunlight. The jets, which had been paddling with the patience of a pilgrim, made 3 short, grateful strokes that set the object into a slightly faster river thread. The orbit fit agreed with a sigh that everyone in the room swears they heard even if they know they didn't. The cadence did not vanish entirely. It grew intermittent, then rare, then became a rumour in the instruments, like a friend who moves to another country and sends postcards until the stamps change. Afterwards, the ordinary world did its ordinary things, argued, scheduled, bought, sold, slept. The uncommon world set about catching up to itself. Standards bodies that write their commandments in small print and big patience added a page. Cooperative quiet windows are now a thing with times, places and margins. Utilities funded the boring work that keeps ripples from becoming cultures. Mariners added a line to a checklist. Guidance, hold acknowledged, hands ready, shoulders soft. Satellite operators took the gentle discipline they'd used under the cadence and turned it inward. Test your kneel, rehearse your rise, fix the part that makes you hesitate. A checkbox called 3-step appeared in control rooms that hate poetry and keeps it anyway, because rituals that worked once are hard to throw away. The map of hinges that had terrified everyone when it was read was repainted. Some lines turned grey where hardening had made them less dramatic. Some grew dotted where decoupling had taken. A few new ribs appeared because we had looked better and found truths we'd been avoiding. We kept the atlas the way survivors keep a scar, uncomfortable when the weather changes, invaluable when telling a certain kind of story to a certain kind of friend. As for belief, it split and rejoined and split again with the days. People who had needed a visitor kept their visitor, now wearing a wristwatch. People who had needed a mask kept their mask and respected the seamstresses more. People who had needed a protocol kept a protocol and started a gentle, unremarkable project. Catalogue the sky for other clocks that do not ask for headlines. The senior astronomer wrote a paragraph she did not publish and a sentence she did. The paragraph said that if the thing had needed to break something, it would have practiced differently. The sentence said, "We were given time." It upset nobody and meant too much. 13 nights after the last window, a small observatory watched the object pass into a dusk where pictures are more wish than record. The coma looked like a lowercase letter, trailing ink. A graduate student who had taught herself to love error bars more than exclamation points swore she saw the fan flick just once in a cadence that made her reach for the desk with one hand. She decided it had been the wind and wrote it down anyway. In another building, a clock that had kept the triplet on its face for weeks went back to marking hours and lunches and bus schedules. In a basement archive, a new drawer labelled with a date but no conclusion received a stack of notebooks with coffee stains and pencil cuts. And on top of the stack, someone put a sticky note with 3 short lines and neat square spaces between them. 3i Atlas slid into a piece of sky where our attention is costly and our curiosity cheaper than it used to be. The Earth, newly self-conscious about its own ring and ripple, kept humming. Engineers in love with verbs kept their lists tidy. Harden, uncouple, curate, rehearse, listen. The rooms where the waterfalls had once spooled like rain learned to listen to quiet the way they once listened to noise. Children heard the story retold as a bedtime thing, all rhythm and no terror. And in a quiet lab where an old lanyard hangs on a peg, someone who has watched too many systems startle and then steady traced a fingertip on the table in a slow, clean 3 and whispered the only certainty that made sense after a season spent counting. The clock was real. The choice was too.